networks, and firewalls. In networking part 4, we're going to be talking about various network types, such as a local area network, wide area network, and virtual private networks. We'll also talk about work groups as opposed to domains. There's really very few advantages of a work group. Mainly, it's a matter of expenses, because you don't have to buy an additional server and a server operating system that you would have to have with a domain. But otherwise, a domain has all the advantages, and work group has very little to offer. Also, we'll take a look here at a firewall overview, what it does, how it's mainly configured, and then we'll actually take a look at the specific configuration of a firewall here at the end. Alright, as we get started here, I want to take some time to define terms that we may have used in the past but not fully defined. And we'll start here with terms such as a local area network. Now, what's a local area network, or a LAN? This is an area of high-speed connectivity. So in this network here, for example, which is kind of a simplified diagram, I have multiple hosts on the same network. They might be desktop computers, servers, they might be printers, all those sorts of things, any host on the network. And they're all interconnected through a high-speed network, such as maybe 10 megabit per second hubs, or 100 megabit per second switches, maybe a gigabit E switches, high-speed routers as well. All of those things might connect multiple networks down here, but they're all high-speed connectivity. So you would generally consider those, that kind of an area, to be a local area network. It's also geographically close together, maybe in the same building or even on the same campus, maybe as in the case of a large corporation or a university. However, if we are trying to communicate with other computers that are in a different state or in a different country or that are miles away, that would not be in our same local area network. Also, this area of high-speed connectivity, you may also hear that referred to as a site in different contexts, such as an Active Directory context. And although that's outside of our scope for the time being, this is also something that would depend upon an area of high-speed connectivity, because it may need to send data to each one of the clients on a network in a site so that it gets up-to-date information about the domain, or maybe changes to the domain, or changes to group policy or security policies, all those sorts of things. But for A+ purposes, local area network, a local area of high-speed connectivity. And then here's another local area network up here. It's geographically distant, perhaps, from this initial local area network. Now we really have two local area networks. Now when we want to connect from this local area network to this local area network, maybe we need to download some files off of a server or something like that, that's when we use something called a wide area network. This might be miles away or in a different state or something, and we would use a WAN link to make that connection, which is a wide area network. So, in the context of a particular computer trying to communicate with another one in this area, that's a local area network. In the context of a computer trying to communicate in this same network, that's a local area network. When you try to communicate from one network to the next, that's when you have comprehensively a wide area network connected by a WAN link. This can be a connection in a number of different types of connections. It could be a T1 link, which is about 1.544 megabits per second. It's a lot slower than some other technologies that we have now, but it's usually highly reliable and guaranteed for a certain amount of uptime from the provider. There's also a fractional T1, which is slower. It can be some fraction of that same speed, except that it's just going to be cheaper, and if you don't need to have particularly high speed, you might go with that option. Could be something like a DSL link here as well. I don't have it really written in here, but it could also be something like a VPN. So you might have a T1 link that's an internet connection here. That's a public internet connection, but through that internet connection, you might also establish a virtual private network. We'll talk a little bit more about VPNs here next. In fact, let's do that now. Here, for example, let's say I've got a user that normally they have their laptop in the office. Down in this network here. However, they're at home right now, and they realize they forgot to connect to the office to create a report, or they realize they want to check their email or something like this. So what they could do is they could take their laptop, use their existing connection to the internet that they use to shop on eBay and shop on Amazon and update their Facebook status and all. Oh, wait a minute. They don't do that at home. They do that at work, right? Okay, anyway, so this is the normal internet connection that they every day use while they're at home. Now, what they want to do is to connect to their home network. So they will create something called, or use something called, a virtual private network. This is a tunneled connection through the public internet, and it's an encrypted tunnel so that nobody can eavesdrop or derive information out of my connection to my local area network. And to create this, normally an IT professional in their workplace is probably going to create a VPN connection for them. And it might use something called point-to-point tunneling protocol, layer 2 tunneling protocol, could use a number of different other technologies from third-party vendors as well. But the basic idea there is, again, it creates a private connection through a public network. Now, in a network, you may have one of two different types of security environments or security models. One of those would be a workgroup environment, which we discussed a little bit, especially when we were talking about sharing resources such as files or sharing printers and things like this. But the other kind of model you might have would be a domain environment. Let's start here, first of all, looking at a workgroup environment. With a workgroup environment, each computer security entity is independent of all the others. So what that means is, on each individual computer, I create my users, I create my groups, but those are only valid users and groups on that one computer. If I have another computer on the network that wants to use the same users and groups, well, you can't. Because there's no way to copy and paste them or to move them to that other computer, something like that. What you would have to do in order to most closely approximate that would be that you would create users of the exact same name and groups of the exact same name. And then on both of those computers, you would have to make sure that the memberships matched up exactly and that the passwords matched up exactly. And if that a user changed their password on one of the computers, that you would have to make sure that it got changed on the other computer as well. Otherwise, things such as sharing folders or printers or something like that and other things that require security credentials, well, that would get broken if there was two different passwords on two different computers. So this does get to be a little bit of an issue in a workgroup environment. And that's what causes resource sharing to become exponentially complicated. Okay? Now, a lot of times you will use the same workgroup name in a local area network, and that's where workgroups normally going to exist, is in a local area network. And the reason why I'll use the same workgroup name is for simpler browsing. By default, Windows computers are usually installed into the workgroup named workgroup. Okay, that's just the way it usually is. And what will happen here is that if you double-click your way through My Network Places or Network Neighborhood, then you'll be able to see other computers in the same workgroup that you're in, and you can more easily browse for them using that method. And then also, with the workgroup, the key thing here is no centralized management. Okay, that's what makes workgroups hard. That's why you have to create separate users and groups on each individual computer. You have to manage everything separately on each individual computer, and it's not practical at all for larger corporations or even any corporation of almost any size. If you're working with 2 or 3 users, maybe you could live with it. But if you're working with dozens even of users and dozens of computers, it's just not practical. And that's when you really need to go to something else. And that's where we would be working with a domain instead. Now, with a domain, you have a central security management. That's normally going to be in something called Active Directory. And that really is a very big deal in terms of that central security management. For example, I can create a user or a group and in Active Directory and use them anywhere throughout that domain. So I don't have to create them separately again on each individual computer. In terms of the scalability of a domain as compared to a workgroup, it's just a world of difference. You really must go with a domain in any kind of a real corporate environment. Also, you get centralized desktop management. You know, before I go on to that one, let me just show you here what I mean by the central security management. Here is in my own domain, which my family uses. I guess we're a bunch of geekazoids here because in the house we have a domain. But anyway, we've got a bunch of computers here and user accounts, and I've got a lot of other ones scattered throughout here as well for different purposes. And you can see here that I might create a single user account here, but I don't have to duplicate that user account elsewhere. Same with my computer accounts and with my security entities here. I create them here when they join the domain, and then I don't have to create them elsewhere in order to have them access resources or to perform tasks that the computer might need permission for. Also, there's centralized desktop management with a group policy object. Now, there's a lot of different things related to GPOs. But in short, this will control virtually every aspect of a user and a computer's security environment. Things such as their passwords, things such as what kind of security is used to confirm that person's identity, what kind of hashes are used for different security mechanisms. Also, every aspect of the user's desktop environment, such as what kind of wallpaper they have if you want to control it that much, whether or not they have the ability to change their desktop settings. All those sorts of things can be controlled through a group policy object. Also, because primarily of this top item with a central security management, we have very simple resource access. I could create a folder and share it to a single security group, for example, and by doing so, I might share it to the entire corporation all within a few seconds. Whereas with a work group environment, that might be a lot more difficult in ensuring that I have user accounts created on each individual computer that would then match the accounts on the computer that's doing the sharing. So it's very, very complicated in a work group, very, very simple in a domain. And I'm again here talking primarily of Active Directory domains. However, an Active Directory domain also mirrors the DNS domain that it has, because there's actually a couple of different types of domains there. Active Directory domains, and then there's also DNS. So in my corporation here, I've got accusource.local as my own domain right here. That's my Active Directory domain, but guess what? My DNS domain is the same name. Okay, and normally with Active Directory, it piggybacks on, or it just borrows from and uses the same name that DNS would use is going to also be used in Active Directory. Now, an integral part of just about any network is going to involve one or more firewalls, particularly if that network is internet connected. And that's just about everybody these days. So let me show you what we'd often see in a corporate environment. And even this is somewhat simplified. But here I've got my local area network. And then here I've got the internet. The job of the network administrator, and this goes beyond A+ scope, but it's just important to know anyway. The job of the network administrator is to protect these folks from these folks. Because there's a lot of bad people out there on the internet, quite honestly, that would love nothing more than to hack into your network, steal your company's secrets, create some kind of a scandal, do whatever else. So in order to protect from that, we need to have one or more firewalls. Now, in this case, I could actually see 3 separate firewalls. Let me show you which ones they are. One firewall would be right here, where we talked about this somewhat in our last nugget, where you might have a proxy or firewall. They often serve both purposes, such as the ISA server from Microsoft. This also performs other functions such as network address translation, again, which we also addressed. But what it would do is it would block most ports from being able to get past this firewall into my private network right here. Okay. Now, you may also have in corporate environments a second firewall here as well. This could be a hardware firewall, or it could be another firewall just like this one. It could be another ISA server. I just drew a different diagram for variety's sake. But the point is, it's another firewall. Now, there's a couple of reasons for having 2 firewalls here. One of those is I might want to be creating a DMZ, also known as a perimeter network in Microsoft parlance, but a DMZ is a demilitarized zone, and a perimeter network is the same thing, just Microsoft's term for it. And here, in a demilitarized zone, which is the section between these 2 firewalls, I might have a server here. Maybe it's my web server. All right, and we host our own web server, and we want our people on the internet public to see our brochures and to download our programs or get whatever else we have, our PR information and the like. So on this firewall, I'm going to have to open port 80, because remember, HTTP uses port 80. So these people need to be able to access this website. This port's got to be open. However, port 80 on this firewall is blocked. That means then the internet public can only go this far, but they can't get past this firewall to then worm their way into my protected local area network, also known as my private network. Now again, you don't need to know about this kind of topology for A+ exam objectives, but I do think you'll need to know about this just for general use. Oh, and I said there was 3 types of firewalls, didn't I? There's another one here that you'll also see on Windows environments. The third one would actually appear on the client. Now, this doesn't have to be Windows firewall, although that's the one we're going to discuss. There are other products that also make firewalls out there, such as any of your normal antivirus vendors, McAfee, Symantec. I use Symantec, and I've been quite happy with it so far and everything. So there's a number of different choices here on the individual clients as well. And one reason why you might want to put or enable the firewalls on the clients also is just number one, a third level of protection, and number two, what if they're a laptop computer? Well, if they don't have a firewall on this laptop and they go out and they fly to a different state or something like that, now they're just out here on the internet, maybe they're connected through an airport Wi-Fi out here, then they're completely unprotected if they don't have a firewall on the actual computer itself. And that's what we're going to go ahead and study next here, is the firewall that appears with Windows. So I think I kind of illustrated this already in my previous whiteboard there, my diagram, but the purpose of a firewall is to prevent unsolicited and often malicious network traffic. We want to keep the hackers out. We also want to just keep out, people that are somewhat innocent, but that might just try to browse into my network just to see what's there. People that kind of, jiggle the handle, so to speak, just to see if the door is open. So we want to prevent any access from people that are uninvited. Also, the firewall can be an operating system firewall like Windows Firewall. Again, software like Symantec or McAfee or any of those other kind of vendors, Panda and so forth. Or it could be hardware such as Cisco, Juniper Networks, other things like this. Now, what you'll want to do is to create certain exceptions. And on the A+ exam objectives, it lists exceptions under FTP, mail protocols, web, several of different kinds of protocols that are listed there on those objectives. It just says exceptions without really saying what that means. Well, what they're talking about there is firewall exceptions where you've opened the ports so that people can access an FTP server in the DMZ, for example, or access a web server in the DMZ, or maybe there's a mail server in the DMZ. So whatever, we create exceptions for traffic that we actually do want to accept. Most firewalls block all network traffic except that traffic that you explicitly allow by opening up the ports. Remember, for example, port 20 or 21 for FTP, port 80 for web, 110 for POP3, for example. So those are all examples. And then you can also make exceptions for programs. Now, in reality, if you make an exception for a program using Windows Firewall, it actually opens up ports. It doesn't open up programs. It's just that Microsoft's operating systems know about certain programs, and it knows that those programs or those services always use a specific port. So if you say, I want to allow XYZ program, it's already kind of pre-configured in the Windows Firewall to open up just exactly the ports that you need. That way you don't have to go in there and do a lot of research to try to find out which ports you need and whether or not to open them both directions and whether they're TCP ports or UDP ports and all that sort of thing. So the fact that we can allow exceptions for specific programs is just kind of a packaged way to open up the appropriate ports without you having to do a whole lot of work to come up with that. Also, if you want to identify the Windows firewall and identify if it has any open ports, you would type net shell firewall show state, all on one command line. And net shell is simply it's a command line tool that you can use in current Windows operating systems, and with that you can command line virtually every aspect of networking. You could create an IP address, rather you could assign an IP address, a subnet mask. You could confirm all the firewall settings. You can create firewall settings. Now, why would you want to use net shell as opposed to just using the UI? Well, you would do that for things like scripting, or if you wanted to apply common settings across multiple computers, you could do that using some kind of a script or something like this. Otherwise, if it's just on an individual basis, probably the UI would be easier. However, for exam objective purposes, I would memorize this bottom line here if you wanted to show what firewall ports were open. Net shell, it's an NATSH, you actually type it just like that, firewall space show space state. And then by way of example, you see here that I've gone ahead and typed in net shell firewall show state. This shows us that it is enabled, and it shows us any ports that might be open. And that would be an important part right there, whether or not it shows any ports that happen to be open. Although I will point out a couple of things about this. Number one, it says that my firewall is enabled. You can see here, it's not, actually, because when I installed Symantec antivirus, it includes Symantec endpoint protection, that is, for my own systems here. It includes a component here that's the network threat protection. That's the firewall version. A lot of times when you install a third-party firewall, it will disable Microsoft Windows firewall. So in reality, this is actually disabled. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and show you here. in just a moment, go to Windows Firewall here in Control Panel, and you can see here that with the red X's here, it's disabled for all of these items. I can go to turn Windows Firewall on or off, and it doesn't even let me. That's because it's being managed by SEP, which is Semantic Endpoint Protection. So a little bit misleading in the way that this might appear. I will tell you that if I were to uninstall the Semantic product, that these would be the settings that would be in effect. Notice also that for Windows 7, it says that the NetShell firewall command is deprecated, and they recommend that we use this instead. That's just a practical note. For the exam purposes, you would still want to know about this bottom line down here. All right, then, so how do we go about actually configuring our firewall? Well, we don't really need to focus on these first two very much because that's not part of A+ particularly, but in a practical sense, if you have a third-party product, then there's going to be some kind of a UI that you can use. Checkpoint, for example, has a very easy-to-use UI that one of our trainers, Bobby Metter, has created for CBT Nuggets. He actually shows you how to do all of that, does a very good job of it. There's also Semantic products will have their own UI as well that will appear on the Start menu, or you can create a shortcut on your desktop for it. Juniper Networks also has a very good interface, very easy to understand. All the three of these are very, very good. And then, of course, you'd have any other kind of product that does a similar thing. There's also hardware firewalls. You can usually telnet into those, such as Cisco. You can telnet into a Cisco device and configure it that way. You can also use a web page. In fact, a lot of even the consumer level firewalls right now also offer an interface like this. By way of example, I'm just going to bring in here my own firewall. I'm just using a consumer level Linksys wireless N gigabit router right here. And you can see here that there's a lot of different configurations that you can make on this. You can specify which ports and so on to restrict or not restrict under access restrictions. You don't need to memorize the interface. I'm not going to show you all of the things there for obvious reasons. I have some security concerns about that. But at least you can get the idea there that you can use an HTTP page from that vendor's hardware. When you want to configure the Windows firewall, you can use a number of different methods, such as the Control Panel. It doesn't give you quite as many options in Control Panel, but you can at least configure the basics there. You can also use the Snap-in. This will give you a higher level of control in the various options you can configure. There's also NetShell, which gives you a high level of control as well, but it requires a high degree of knowledge in what you would actually have to type in. That can be quite complicated. And then in corporate environments, you can centrally configure how all of your clients' firewall settings should look by using a group policy object to centrally configure all of that configuration. And then when the clients update their group policy, and they can do this every few minutes, as well as the fact that besides that automatic updating that takes place every 90 to 120 minutes, or it also could take place when they restart the computer, you can also do this by command line. Let me just show you what you would type in here. If I knew that there was a recent update to a group policy object in my domain, and I wanted to get that right away, I would type gp update, and then I could do a force, for example. I can't seem to type right now. A gp update space / force, and that would force me to download and apply the current policy. And if I had a new firewall setting in that group policy object, then it would apply immediately here after this has completed its task. Okay, and you can see here that it has then applied any updates that might have occurred. I would memorize that, by the way, as well for GPO. It doesn't really have much of a place in A+. Nevertheless, they might sneak it in there somewhere, I'm guessing. So GP update, it will update your group policy objects. And if you want to force it to happen, even if there's not really been any updates, if you still want it to do so, you can do a space / force. Otherwise, it just checks for versions, and it will only update the policies if it detects that there's a new version, if you run GP update without any switches. So to access Windows Firewall through Control Panel, you simply access Control Panel, and then almost every stage you can get to the firewall through one method or the other. So I could go right there right now through that link or through this one down here. And then I could also just go to Security and then go to Windows Firewall. Again, notice that I have 3 or 4 links here. One there, one here, one down here. So they really all take you to the same place, but I'm just going to go the long way around here and click on Windows Firewall. Then if I choose Change Settings, again, you can see other links there as well. It really just takes you to the same dialog box. It's this thing right here. Okay, whichever link I chose that I've already shown you would actually take you to the same dialog. It's just which place it would start you at. So if you wanted to allow a program through, it would take you to the Exceptions tab, for example. But notice that by default, Windows Firewall is on. That's a recommended setting. You can also turn it off. You don't really normally need to do that, and I don't recommend that you do. Sometimes there may be a program or a service that you're trying to install that will not properly install with the firewall turned on, so you might temporarily turn it off. But if you only do that if you have to, and only temporarily, of course. There's also, with leaving this on, you can also block all incoming connections, which would be an additional level of protection, but you don't normally need to do that. Also, there's the Exceptions tab, and let's go ahead and address what kind of exceptions are there. When you enable certain services or you turn on certain features in Windows Vista, it normally will automatically enable certain things. For example, I've enabled Remote Desktop. In fact, that's how I'm accessing this Windows interface right now, is through Remote Desktop, kind of like I mentioned earlier. Okay, see, it's actually in a window. I'm making a Remote Desktop connection right here. So when I chose to enable Remote Desktop connection through the Windows properties, what it did was it enabled this checkbox right here. This actually, if I go to Properties, you'll see that it's going to enable access from the desktop from a remote system. Notice that it doesn't tell me that it's actually opening up port 3389, though. And there's a little link there that asks you how you can edit all the properties. I'll show you how to do that myself here in just a moment. So anyway, you enable a service. It should automatically select an item here, but if it gets deselected for some reason, or if somebody messed it up, then you can just go back in here and click on whichever item it is that you need. You can also go back through here and select this item, Notify Me when Windows Firewall blocks a new program. And when it does so, you can have a prompt to enable that program to access through the firewall. You can also add a program manually here as well. These would be installed applications that Windows knows about, or you could browse for additional programs that might not be installed in program files or have their own unique directory somehow or something of this nature. You can also click on Change Scope here, and you can say that you want to block or not block is a specific computer or any computer or whatever. This dialog kind of explains itself. But if I wanted to unblock a port only so that only a specific computer could access it, then I would say only a custom list, and I would enter in the IP address or MAC address of the destination. Excuse me, not IP address or MAC address. It would be IP address, IP version 4, or IP address version 6. And the example they show down here, that's actually a version 6 IP address. Aren't you glad you don't have to know about that for the A+ exam? Anyway, so you could enter that in. Or you could allow for My Network subnet only, so only your same subnet. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. But anyway, you could just select whichever one you wanted, or if you wanted to do it by port instead, then you could do that as well. Now, what's the advantage for doing this according to program or according to port? For example, if we move back up here, for Remote Desktop, remember I said that uses port 3389. By selecting this checkbox, it will open up that port only when Remote Desktop is activated. When I close Remote Desktop, it closes that port as well. That's a very important distinction to make, not for A+ purposes, I don't think, but definitely it is an additional security measure so that you don't have ports that are just constantly left open and potentially vulnerable to attack. It only opens those ports when you're actually using them. But if I click on Add Port and I open up, a specific port number, RDP for 3389 or whatever other port it is, and then click OK, then it leaves that port open constantly. And that would be a little bit less secure, of course, because of opening up a potential vulnerability that's constantly available. And then we could go to the Advanced tab here as well, and you can specify which network connections you want to enable the firewall on. I've only got the one here, so there's not really a lot to show you in that particular interface. But like I said before, there's also other interfaces that you can also use. And then I mentioned that there's also a snap-in you can use for this. So if I just go to a command prompt and type MMC or to the run or the search, and then what I would want to do here is I would go ahead and choose File, Add Remove Snap-in, and I'd look for not Firewall, but Windows Firewall, and there it is right there. So I'd add that in, and that would be for the local computer, but you can also remotely connect to another computer. I'm just going to click OK real quick here. And then you can see here that I'm now able to go to inbound rules, and you can see that several of the things that we have looked at here are already pre-configured here. So, for example, Remote Desktop is already pre-configured in here. Remote Assistance, as you can see right here, already pre-configured. Okay, this is just the actual more detailed view of the same thing that I just showed you for Remote Desktop a while ago. Okay, it's actually the same thing, and there's the port number, 3389. Okay, so just more detailed. Normally, you want to block all inbound traffic except for anything that you make an exception for. That would be the green items that we see right here. And you can also set up outbound rules as well. Normally, outbound traffic is not going to be blocked unless you specifically block a specific item. For either one of these, if you want to create a new rule, you simply click New Rule by right-clicking and choosing New Rule, and then choose whether it's a program or a specific port or something predefined. That would be the same list that we saw earlier. For example, Windows Media Player, I think, was in there earlier and so forth. And that would again then be kind of a chunk of pre-configured settings that you could go ahead and use. Or you could choose a custom rule, and I'll just go ahead and click Next here. Oops, click Next there. And then you can specify a specific program or all programs or services, whatever it is that you would want to do. And then you just continue on through the wizard, and it's a pretty simple wizard to work with in that respect. Also notice, by the way, that if I kind of expand this out, notice that a lot of these say domain, private, public. Some of them just say domain. What's the difference here? Well, that relates to something called network location awareness that I also need to briefly address here. You see, depending upon what you're connected to, the different firewall rules will actually take place. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here, for example, if I take this laptop, and I'll just draw another one down here. If I take this laptop, I'm not very good at 3D drawings, but I'll give it a try here. So there's my laptop, all right? And I'm in the airport on their Wi-Fi. Well, I am not protected by any of my firewalls that are set up at my perimeter network or anything like that I normally would have if I were in my own LAN. So now I'm basically unprotected out here in this network. Now you have to ask yourself some questions. Would I want people to be able to double-click through shares that are on my computer? Even if they're denied NTFS permissions, I might still not want them to double-click their way through there. Other people in the airport who are just kind of clicking their way through network neighborhood, I wouldn't want them to even see my computer, for example. Likewise, it's not really necessary for me to browse through things there either. I just want to access the internet, for example. Well, when we're in that kind of a connection, we're in what we call a public connection. And you'll see Windows very often have a dialog box that pops up, and when you make a new network connection, it'll ask you where you are, whether you're at work, whether you're in a public environment, those sorts of things. And you just answer the obvious questions. We're also home. Actually, it's home, work, or public. And that would be like this kind of a situation. We're in a coffee shop or a Wi-Fi at the airport, something like this. And if I choose something like the public option there, then it would disable any of the network discovery that would take place so that I am not able to browse the network there, and no one is able to browse my computer on the network either. And in addition, there may be additional firewall rules that have been configured that will, throw up additional protections for me when I'm on the public network. However, if I'm a work network, then it will loosen some of that up because there's an assumption that we already have some additional level of security there and a higher level of trust. There's actually another one that can appear as well, and that one's called domain. If the laptop, is up here in the network, and then we're in our home network and everything, and we log on to a domain controller in my network, it automatically places me in the domain network location awareness type, and I don't have to specify that using any particular interface. And when it does that, then again, it will provide different kinds of rules for me. For example, it will allow network browsing, it allows network discovery, and I can find other shares on the network and so forth, and I'm also visible on the network for other people to browse potentially. And then the other kind of configure I told you about was already when I showed you net shell. And then finally, there's also group policy object. Let me just quickly show you here a group policy object item, and I'm going to go to group policy management for my own domain. And I have an unlinked policy there that I'm just going to show you because it doesn't actually have anything that I use that's in action on my network. I just use this for experimentation and so forth and for demonstration purposes. So as I open that up, we'll see here we've got my group policy management editor. And if I wanted to configure firewall policies, I'd go under computer configuration policies, Windows settings, security settings, and then further on down here you would see Windows firewall with advanced security. I need to probably expand this out so you can see it a little bit better, like this. But we'd see Windows firewall with advanced security, and then inbound rules. So what I would do here is if I had a new rule that I wanted to specify that everybody had, I would right click here, choose new rule, and then I would come up with whatever configuration I wanted, whether it was a port, and here's our wizard that it starts for us. Maybe it's a port that I need to open up so that people can, so that maybe I have some kind of management software that needs to go through the firewall on each individual client computer and run a report of, let's say, what software they have installed on that computer. Maybe that requires a specific TCP port. Let's just call it, port 7000. Okay, and then I would just click OK, click next here. And then I would say allow the connection. I could also say allow the connection only if it's secure, and then I could do a number of different things. I could say require the connection to be encrypted. That would be available for me if I'm running Windows Vista or later. I could also say allow the connection to use null encapsulation. And this would authenticate the connection so that we could be sure that both parties in the connection were indeed valid parties and not impersonators or something like that, but it doesn't have any privacy protection. In other words, it doesn't have any kind of encryption or anything like that. So those are some of the types of options that you can see with that. And then you can also block the connection entirely. So I might allow the connection if it's secure, or I'll just choose allow the connection for simplicity's sake. Then this is where we would also specify whether we wanted to allow it only for the domain, private, or public. Now, obviously, a private, when you make a new connection, it says, what's it say? Work, home, or public. I wish they would correlate that to these items, because private and domain are both actually the same as work in terms of most of the settings that you see for that. Public would be the same as what we see in the interface there. In this case, however, I would probably want to leave this only on for the domain if I was actually in a domain environment and I had some kind of software that was scanning the computer to look for software that was installed and stuff like that. So I'd probably leave it like this. Otherwise, if I left it on for public as well, that would be an open port that someone could potentially find that was open and exploit my computer. So I want to close that down when I'm in public. And then you just name it and finish it, and that's pretty much all there is to that. But then once I had done that, I would then have a group policy object configured here, and we would be ready to go for that. In networking part 4, we talked about the various network types that you might run into: local area networks, wide area networks, and virtual private networks. We also talked about work groups as opposed to domains, and as you saw, there's really not much advantage to a work group other than the fact that you wouldn't have to buy an additional server hardware for a domain, and you wouldn't have to buy Windows Server 2008, for example, for a domain either. So you'll save thousands in that respect, but only useful for very, very small environments. Otherwise, a domain has all the advantages. Also, we looked at an overview of the firewall, what kind of things it's designed to do, as well as how to configure a firewall, in particular, Windows Firewall. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.